So the history is that a computer science student and a linguistics professor in UC Berkeley got together. The computer student was not able to do his studies because UC Berkeley's facility had some problem with the foundation. The building sank. So they had to move the computers onto these portable buildings, and basically it didn't really work very well. So in the meantime, he had to find something to do. So he started editing books. The first was by a guy named Fritz Perls, who I think he was like renting a room from the guy or something like that. Fritz Perls is the person that started Gestalt therapy. He's the person that invented that, created it. And so he was writing books about it, and Richard Bandler is the gentleman's name. He was the student, and he started editing the book, and he started realizing that there's something going on here. Well, first of all, I don't know if you know anything about Gestalt therapy or not, but it's a process of hallucinating. Basically, you hallucinate your relatives in a chair, and then you talk to them, and you do all this kind of stuff. And but at any rate, that's one of the things. So he was fascinated with this. He's like, oh, really? So they're getting people to hallucinate stuff, and then. So he got into it, and he started realizing that he was using certain phrases regularly, certain patterns of speech. And he went to the linguistics professor, and he said, well, what are we doing here? You know, what's going on? And can we figure out how this is working? So they broke it all down into the specific language parts, and they tried to analyze what was going on. And then they started doing this with other people. It was an interesting place, UC Santa Cruz at the time, because Virginia Satir was also there. Do we have someone else coming?
Just seeing if somebody was wondering.
Did you reach a conclusion on that?
Not that I can see there. I didn't try to move my head. I tried to move my eyes just a little bit, but I did invite a few people, and I guess, like I said.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. No, I'm just curious. I just think if they were coming.
Satir.
Yeah. So Virginia Satir is the grandmother of, now considered to be the grandmother. She was really the originator of family therapy, where they would take the whole family in and work on the dynamics within the family. And she was using certain language patterns and things too to help people to figure out what their problem was. One of the things that they came up with at this point, because they were using all the information that they could get. So they would videotape the sessions, they would sit in the sessions with the people, they would record audio recordings, they would interview the clients afterwards. They just did everything they could do to try and figure out what was actually happening. And they didn't even realize really what they were doing, except they were studying this phenomena. This lady was having great success. And so they were trying to figure out how that was happening. She worked in the mental hospitals, but she didn't work with the patient. She worked with the staff to help them to get along and figure out what was going on there. So that's where she was, and the kind of results she was getting were pretty phenomenal, especially in the family dynamics, because she was able to help people in ways that other people couldn't. So, psychotherapy kind of started out with Freud, who would sit in the room with the person, but he'd turn his back to them because he didn't want to influence them in any way. So then he would talk to them and ask them questions, and that sort of disconnection kind of, he thought, helped the person be more genuine, that sort of thing. And so that was kind of where it started, and then it did morph from there, and they stopped turning their backs on people a long time ago. But he even said that that psychotherapy in conjunction with hypnosis would have great results, but at the time the hypnosis piece didn't really get developed very well at that point. But it went through a lot of different things. So the idea of inviting a family or a group into a therapy session was pretty innovative, to go from having your back turned on the client to, let's have a whole group of people interact. That was, that was new for the West. Wasn't necessarily new in certain places in the world. Like in Polynesia, they would do things with families, like when families would have problems with each other, they'd try and get the families together to talk it out and solve the problems that way. But that's another story. Although it is in some ways related, because there are influences in NLP from all over the place. And the Polynesian areas, the influences from Heynow, which was their way of looking at their lifestyle, but it was like their religion, their belief system and everything, they call it Heynow. And And that's where some influence in NLP comes from that area, because there was some work done in Hawaii in the early years of NLP, that sort of thing. So a little bit of that's still around. But here's what they wound up doing. They wound up writing a book, because what they discovered with Virginia Satir is that she would have people get more and more specific about what was going on. So what they were discovering is that the language that people were using, this is still the case, it left sentences and ideas incomplete, and a lot of assumptions have to be made by the other person in order to proceed with the conversation. But those assumptions aren't necessarily really good assumptions, and they're not necessarily accurate. And so they were finding holes in the conversations, holes in the sentences where things weren't being talked about, where I shot an elephant in my pajamas is an interesting sentence, because clearly I was the one who did something, and either myself or the elephant was wearing pajamas at the time, and I either shot them with a gun or maybe with a camera. It's hard to say, you know. So we don't really know what was being said there when you break it down. We know that there was me and there was an elephant and something happened.
I thought the pajamas were on you.
Well, they could have been,
But
right.
you clarified it just now.
But, well, it's not clear. So, yeah. So there you go. So all sentences are like that, you know. So all sentences leave some bit unsaid. So he just says, I thought the pajamas were on you. Well, that's great. So we know who was doing it. Then we know that they were thinking, and we know that there are some pajamas involved, and apparently there's some specific pair of pajamas involved, but without him going into a lengthy description of it, we're not really sure what that pair of pajamas is. But the conversation, anyway, in a family therapy thing, things like they said something, someone says there's no communication. Well, that's obviously not the case. There's something's being communicated somewhere. So this idea of no communication, they took, I'm going to illustrate one of the ideas. So communication is, then becomes a noun, and there's apparently not any of it. But communication is not a noun. Communication is designed, the word is designed to be a verb, communicating. And when you make it a noun, it's what we call a nominalization, where you're turning a verb into a noun. Now, turning a verb into a noun is something that we do in order to discuss things like transportation or communication or, or taxes. You know, taxes is really a verb. Taxing is actually an act of transferring money from one individual to another. It's not a noun. So when someone says, you know, your taxes, they're actually breaking a verb down, they're making it look like a noun. So we can talk about it that way, and in some ways it's helpful, but in other ways it's not helpful, because it can get in the way, and when you have a lot of vagueness in a conversation, a lot of assumptions can be made. So that's just one example. But if there's a couple of examples actually, because we talked about the pajamas and the elephant. So this is how things can get confusing, and a lot of times within the family dynamics, what Virginia Satir was finding was that this is a big problem. So they wrote a book called The Structure of Magic, and it basically broke out this language pattern system. They figured out all of these, what the holes are. They named them, they called them something, and they categorized them, and they wrote a book about it. And it wasn't, I don't know, it wasn't a huge book, but they had just begun their research. They thought they had discovered all this great stuff, but they had yet to come to Phoenix to talk to Milton Erickson, who taught them a whole nother way of using language. Because what Milton would do is he used trance work, or like what we call hypnosis normally. I don't know normally, but you can call it hypnosis, you can call it trance. I think if you call it hypnosis, it's got certain connotations and people have ideas about it. When someone's in a trance, they can be in any kind of a trance. You can be in a driving trance, you can be in a television trance, reading a book is like a trance. You create a whole nother world for yourself. All these different things are different types of trance states. So when you say hypnosis, then everybody thinks, oh, I know exactly what that is. Well, it's probably, they have a rough idea of what they think hypnosis is, but they probably don't know that we slip in and out of these different trances all day long. So it's normal for us to alter our state of consciousness, to be in one state of consciousness in one situation, another state in another situation. Some of them have our mind highly focused, and in some of them our mind is not focused. It's focusing on multiple things at the same time. So when we're focusing on multiple things at the same time, it runs a little bit less efficient, but it's also not open for much as far as suggestions go. If you give the mind something to focus on, then whatever else is going on just goes into the subconscious without it really realizing it. And in NLP, what we usually use is context-based information rather than content-based information. Because the content of something doesn't necessarily matter to us very much. We can change the way a person thinks about anything. So it doesn't matter what they're thinking about. If they want to think about it differently, we'll just help them think about it differently. I don't even need to know what the issue is. If someone comes to me and they're like, I have this issue. Every time I think about this, I think about that. And we'll figure out a way to make things not happen that way. Or they might not even tell me what it is. Every time there's certain things, and every time I'm doing it, I feel a certain way about it, and I don't like that, and then we can just help them rearrange the way they feel about a particular thought, or a particular idea, or whatever. But without even knowing what the idea is, we can make those kinds of changes. So it's interesting. So at any rate, in the process of this, they started to discover other things. Richard is really the genius behind NLP. He is the co-founder, because the linguistics professor is John Grinder. So the two of them founded it together, but Richard is really the impetus for the whole thing. Richard is the one that was editing the book and going, hang on, let's figure this out. Richard is the one that went did work with Virginia to figure out how she was doing. Richard also would just absorb the stuff and then just use it. And then people wrote about what Richard was doing, because Richard was just a major catalyst in the whole thing. There were a few other people that were around at the same time that Gregory Bateson was around, and so was I think even in the early days Judith Delosier was around. There were other people that were coming together. They started meeting on like a Wednesday night just to people come together that had been working on this stuff, and they would teach each other, they would demonstrate to each other, they would just try and figure out what was happening. And in fact, that's one of Richard's main things, is what the fuck's going on around here? What's going on here? And let's figure it out. So they discovered that our minds work faster than we think, and that's an interesting. That's also a John Lavelle quote, but that's I know these people, so it's interesting to give them credit for the ideas that they've brought out. But let's get back to what NLP does. So they started realizing that there are certain things going on. For instance, language was a big part of it. We will only think within the structure of our language. So if we don't have a language for a certain thing, we don't really think about it. And one of the things that's commonly brought out is that I think the Mayans, or who was it that was that when Coronado invaded in Mexico or the Yucatan or wherever he landed, the people that were there couldn't see the ships. They had no concept of a ship. And so even though the ships were right offshore, they rode in on the rowboats. They could see the rowboats because they had little boats that they got around in. But this idea of a ship was one that they couldn't until it was explained to them, and then all of a sudden the ships appeared. But the people couldn't even see them because they didn't have an idea of it. It wasn't something that they, So that's how powerful language and our minds are. And they came across several ideas. One is that we distort virtually everything that comes in to our mind. We distort it, we generalize about it. So one bad thing happens with a red Corvair, and now, all of a sudden red Corvairs are, clearly there's a problem. We generalize in that way. And then we also delete things. So we distort, delete, and generalize. Those are the three main things that we do. And so deletion is obviously the people that couldn't see the ships, they were deleting that information. We delete a lot of information, which is how magicians do what they do. Because we're paying attention to what they're doing, but we're deleting the part that is what they're actually doing. And they're counting on that. They know that that's what we're doing.
Are there any times where it's not distorted? Where it's sitting right through like it was intended? You said
Well,
generalized, or is that inside the categorized categories?
Well, I suppose the idea of whether or not it's ever not distorted is an interesting idea. It's an interesting question. And I'm not sure how we go about answering that.
Don't stress. Because I like to think,
However,
we're talking right now,
I believe that it is possible to experience directly what's going on. But imagine this. So there is a huge amount of information around you right now that your conscious mind is not paying attention to. The color of the wall behind you, the shadows under your chair, the things that are going on, whatever might be happening out the door now, that whatever else, the sound of the fan, the coolness of the breeze blowing by, the temperature of your skin against the fabric of the chair, or whatever. I mean, there's all this information happening, and we're deleting most of it because it's too confusing to be inundated with that much information. So we've learned, since we're little, because little babies don't delete any of that stuff. They take everything in, Everything is interesting and exciting to them. They're just soaking it all up. But they also have to learn to focus, They have to learn to, there's a point in time when their eyes start to follow you, and they say, well, their eyes haven't developed. And it could be that it's a mechanical, physiological development of their eyes. But it may also be a development of their mind that starts to say, okay, well, here's how the eyes can focus now. And because I think a little baby probably doesn't even know how to focus its eyes. Its eyes probably just, focus at random until it figures it out. Once it starts to figure it out, then it starts to go, okay, well, now I can pay attention to specific things in the room, like my parents' faces, my mother's eyes, those sorts of things. I think that starts to just, happen and build over time, and it just, until eventually, now we can delete all that because that stuff's not as important. Now the important thing is, are we getting our time in front of the TV, or are we, is mom bringing us our food when we need it, or whatever kind of thing it is. So we don't necessarily delete the look of your mother's faces. I think that was a little extreme, but that kind of stuff is that's the basis of how it works. Children go through branching out of things where they start to connect everything that's going on in their environment. They start to understand it, and then they prune that back, and because a lot of it's useless information. You don't need to know everything about a painting on the wall in your aunt's house or something like that. It's just not important. So that stuff gets pruned back, and then new stuff grows. And we kind of do this all the time, but in children it happens on a regular basis. They go through a phase where they're pruning. They're starting to focus on what things that they want to focus on. And then they grow out again, and then they prune again. So all these connections are made and broken as we develop. What remains may or may not serve us the way we want it to. So how do we deal with it if it doesn't? And there's two possible things that could happen. It may not serve us the way we want it to because we want to do something in a new direction that we hadn't explored before. So that's like generative change. That's like we want to create new neural pathways, new networks, new ways of connecting ideas in our own mind, and we want to maybe empower those or start to use those more readily or things like that. That's generative work. NLP is excellent for that, because what NLP has done over the years and the way they developed the information that they did, they started off by interviewing people and doing all this stuff. And then they started to just model the person that was doing the work. They realized that if they just took on the attributes of the person that was doing the work, that they could then explore and determine which of those attributes were essential and which were idiosyncratic. So certain numbers of things are essential, and certain number of things are idiosyncratic in any given environment, probably, or with anyone doing anything. So for instance, Milton Erickson wore purple shirts all the time. He said he was colorblind, but the color purple spoke to him somehow. So he would wear that, but apparently he was colorblind. So I don't know how that works. And he wasn't apparently very forthcoming about it either. He was just kind of, no, I'm tone deaf and colorblind. So it's hard to tell if he was actually tone deaf and colorblind. He may have just been saying that. But that might have just... So at any rate, when they first started learning, and he was in a wheelchair because he had polio. So when they first started learning, they got in wheelchairs, they wore purple shirts, they talked like Milton Erickson, and because you kind of talk like this, and there's a few videos of him out there. If you want to watch them on YouTube and stuff, there's a few. There's some better ones, but they're a little more challenging. You have to know people that have them and that sort of thing. But at any rate, so they would literally take on all of his attributes, and then they would start to eliminate them to see if that was an essential piece. And they discovered that a purple shirt was not essential, that was an idiosyncratic piece for him. That's just who he was, and that was his personality. So, but what they did discover was that his use of language was essential, and not just his use of language, but his whole style of using language, and the way he did certain things. He talked about something called rapport, which is a basic NLP skill now. And rapport is a way of achieving a level of harmonious relations with another person, and that level can be kind of superficial, or it can be a very deep level. It kind of depends, but it's taught as a series of techniques. Now, that leads me to the definition of NLP, which is a little bit challenging. Most people look at NLP as the series, as the trail of techniques that's left behind from the modeling process that they go through. But NLP is really, the modeling is an essential part of NLP and how it gets to be what it is, and modeling is still encouraged in NLP, although most practitioners are not good modelers. They're not necessarily even learning modeling, but it was the piece that was originally what inspired NLP. Was they started to take stuff on, they wanted to model it, they wanted to be proficient at it. A lot of work has been done in some areas. So let me tell you what Richard did. This is how he claims he named it. He said he got pulled over by the cops, and they said he was doing something, and they're like, well, where are you headed, or what are you doing, or something like that, and he had to come up with an explanation for it. So he looked over on the floor of his car, and here was a book on language, and a book on neurology, and a book on programming, computer programming. So he's like, we do neurological, linguistic programming. So that's how he says he named it. Now, I don't know, but it's an interesting story. Why not? I sometimes don't know about the actual factual accuracy of certain things, because in NLP, a lot of things are taken as metaphor, whether they're factual or not. They're still metaphorical. So, and that's the interesting thing about studying history, is that some of that stuff is factual, but not everything in a history book you count on to be completely factual. There are certain liberties taken and certain points of view that are had by the authors and that sort of thing. So, like there's a point of view that Shakespeare didn't write the plays. So now there's a whole, there was a play or movie or something made about that not too long ago. And so that's an interesting idea. I don't know if it's true or not. But when you say Shakespeare's plays, everybody knows the plays you're talking about. So it makes sense to just refer to it that way now. You know, I don't know how useful it is, even if it's accurate. I don't know how useful it is to take that on. But let's look at things more personal, and let's look at the usefulness of certain beliefs that we might have, because we might not want to believe certain things because we can't prove it. You know, we can't prove that it's like that. Okay, but if you believe that, how beneficial would it be? And if it would be really beneficial, then it might make sense to believe it, whether it's true or not. If it works, you know, you want to do something different, and there's something that works, you might as well believe in it. You can't prove most of this stuff. That was an interesting question earlier about, you know, well, what's, you know, I don't remember the exact question, but it was along those lines. Is this actually true, or can you, you know, what would happen? Is it provable? And in NLP, we say, well, it doesn't really have to be provable. It has to be as believable and something that you can that makes life better, you know. And so then we'll go with that. So NLP discovered a few things, or uses a few things, and what it's done is it's borrowed not from theories and techniques, but from people that are actually getting great results in their field. And it's been used to coach in sports, it's been used to coach in the stock market, it's been used to coach in politics, it's been used to coach in the churches, the ministers and stuff like that. In fact, when they wrote a book called Persuasion Engineering. This is Richard Bandler, and the gentleman he's working with now is called John Lavelle, and they have NLP Seminars International, I think is the name of their company. But at any rate, they wrote a book called Persuasion Engineering, which is about how to sell things, how to persuade people, you know, how to do that. And the first 5,000 copies that they had printed were ordered by Oral Roberts University. So before, right, yeah. So and it makes sense. They want their people to be good persuaders. Whether or not you believe in their cause, I don't know, but you know, but it makes sense that they would want to do that. And so this is the versatility of NLP. NLP is not simply. It was used also to create the sharpshooter program for the military, so that the military could teach a standardized version of how to become a sharpshooter. They called the NLP guys in, and the NLP guys went and broke it down. They studied the best of the best, and they figured out what they were doing, and put it in, I think, 3 or 4 basic steps. You know. It's fairly easy to teach now, and they don't have to have the best people at shooting a rifle trying to teach a bunch of recruits how to shoot a rifle, because they may not even know how they do it. They just do it. So, and that's what they found with a lot of experts. A lot of experts can't explain what they do. So when they go in and do modeling, they take on the attributes of the experts, and they study what's the most efficient thing about them, and they teach that. They break it down to its component parts where it's teachable. And you can learn from those techniques, you can learn and become competent faster than if you had to learn everything somebody did and then determine for yourself which was the, you know, usable pieces and that sort of thing. So as far as an apprenticeship goes, NLP technique is much faster, because it takes what's essential, breaks it down, teaches that. You can do the rest of the stuff however you want, you know. But as long as you do the essential pieces in the right, you know, in the most effective way, you're going to get the results. So that's what NLP started as a modeling technique, and then they discovered that there was, because they were modeling and they were creating a trail of techniques, they had a bunch of techniques that they could teach, and then that became what's considered to be NLP courses now. So they included a bunch of other things. Like, for instance, Richard Bandler noticed that when somebody said, well, I can see myself doing certain things, that the person would be looking up. But if you talk to them about things that they heard, they would be looking sideways. They'd pretty much be going, you know, flat across. And if it's what they felt, they would be looking down and always in one particular side or the other. And then there was another side that had to do with what they thought about things, like what the meanings of things are, what their internal dialogue was about certain things. So, and they call that auditory digital, because they named everything. This is another thing. So this part's a little funny because in NLP they had all these ideas going on, and they had this linguistics professor and a bunch of other people at the university there, and they would name everything that they thought of. You know, they would come up with stuff and they would name it, and they gave it all these crazy names. Well, like neuro-linguistic programming. I mean, how inaccessible can you get? You know, that's pretty out there, right? Just in the name of what it is. But I was thinking about this earlier today, because this is something that NLP uses also, and it's called anchoring in NLP. But you know, when two things occur together, the occurrence of one will always bring up the memory of the other. This is what Aristotle said back in the day, and it was proven by Pavlov with ringing the bell and having the dog salivate, because he would feed him every time he rang the bell. Then he noticed the dogs would salivate even if there was no food present. So that proved that piece of it. But humans and really all animals use the same thing. They use some sort of anchoring process for a lot of stuff. So, I mean, like dogs, and I don't know if you've ever seen a dog trainer use a clicker, but that's an anchor. So the dog does the right thing, you get the click. So the dog gets the reward, so he knows, hey, I've done the right thing. So it just continues on like that, and they can train him. But humans do it in a lot of different ways too. So we see a red corvair. I don't want to talk about red corvairs. I don't want to talk about corvairs at all, but I guess it's appropriate if everybody knows what the old-time cars are. Actually, my family had corvairs when I was a kid, but they never had a red one. But I do remember there was one corvair that my family had that had a hole in the floorboard, and we would drop bottle caps out the hole when we were driving along. Anyway, it was just entertainment, you know. I'm sure in today's world, if you had your kids in the back seat of a car with a hole in the floorboard, they'd think you were a bad parent, you know. Yeah, but that's okay. We used to just hop in the back of the pickup anyway. We didn't care, you know. I don't even think they had helmets for bicycles when I was a kid. So certainly had bicycles, and we'd build those little ramps and jump them as often as we could. Anyway, so NLP has a lot of these types of things in it. The anchoring is a big part of it. One of the things about anchoring that's interesting is that I was thinking about this today. So you have two things that occur simultaneously. So you have, when one happens, the other one, you know, the reflection or the echo of the other one happens, and then the way that they eliminate that is by calling it collapsing the anchor, which, and when you think about what an anchor is, like in the real world on a ship, and it's not really collapsible, so I don't understand why they use that term in, you know, I'm not sure why they use the term anchor in the first place, but anyway, that's just what they did. And then if you eliminate an anchor through, like, saying, putting a bunch of positive feelings together and associating them with something that you'd had a negative feeling about, you can collapse the negative feeling or reduce it. But calling it collapsing seems a little out of place too. But everything in NLP has got its own little idiosyncratic terminology for it. So we don't just make an association, we say make an anchor. And then we don't say, okay, let's cut the anchor or let's eliminate the anchor, we collapse it. So that's just a little bit about it. So it's got its own way of talking and its own kind of terminology, and in a way, though, that's probably beneficial because it does teach the practitioner to think differently and gives them different reference points for how to do that and why to do that. And so it might make sense to have its own language in a way, but it seems a little frivolous to me. So let's, I want to talk a little bit more about, do you know what time it is now? There's usually a clock right there.
8:15.
Okay, good. We'll go for a while longer. Do you guys have any questions about this? You know anything? Have you had any NLP experience at all?
No, I mean, I've read some books.
Did you? What have you read? If I may. If you remember.
I don't.
Okay. Well, that's okay. The early books by Bandler and Grinder were hard to read because they were very technical, and the later books, what they did is they just recorded his teaching, and they just said, okay, well, here's a book. They transcribed the class he was giving or whatever, and they said, here's your book. So that's a little interesting. then there were a few books written by the Andres folks, and they had a place in Colorado that they called NLP Comprehensive. And Stephen Andres was actually a writer, so he could write, so he did. And I don't know how Richard Bandler wound up editing books, but he couldn't really write. He wasn't, you know, I mean, he couldn't, but it's okay, because some of the later stuff is good, and the stuff where they did his classes and stuff, that stuff's good, you know. But it does read more like a conversation or more like a lecture than a book. So some of the books are, I don't know how easy it is to get the desired information from it, because NLP is typically taught in both a lecture and participation piece. So they lecture a little bit about the topic, and then they have exercises that people do that put them in touch with whatever it is that's going on. So that part of it is good, because it has to be really demonstrated and experienced. You can't get the experience of collapsing an anchor if you have a certain particular way of looking at something and you want to look at it differently, and you read a book about it, it's one thing, but if you actually go through the practice and do it, it's a completely different thing. So it's helpful when it comes to this type of work to actually be available to actually do it and demonstrate it to yourself, demonstrate it on someone else. Usually it's done in groups of 3s, typically, because there's a person doing the exercise, a person that is having the exercise done to them or with them, and then there's usually an observer piece that's watching them too, because you can learn a lot by watching someone else do something. And it's not as easy to learn if you're in the middle of trying to, you know, move a picture from one place to another. So here's what it works a lot with a variety of things. So first of all, there's languaging, because a lot of times the way we talk to ourselves tells us what's going on. In fact, there's a guy that is associated with NLP because he uses a lot of NLP in his work, Tony Robbins. And he uses a lot of NLP and credits NLP with a lot of stuff. But where was I going with that? Was something that he said. I know. But I was going someplace in specific with it when I started thinking of his name, and I thought of his name, and then I went off in a little diversion in my mind, and from there I didn't know how to get back to where I started. So he uses a lot of NLP, and he talks a lot about it, and I don't know where I was before I got on him. So NLP uses anchoring, it uses languages, and it uses the different representational systems that we use, which are the 5 senses. So there's visual, auditory, and kinesthetic is feeling. And then we use a little bit of olfactory, sense of smell, and a little bit of gustatory, the sense of taste. So primarily in an NLP practice, it's going to be the first 3. It's going to be visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. And the visual can be internal or external, a picture that you're making or something that you're seeing. The auditory, the same thing can happen, and then the kinesthetic can be the sense of touch, or it can be a feeling, like I feel something in my chest, or I feel something in my throat, or this or that, or I have some